For more than a decade, Russia has believed that Crimea was untouchable. The peninsula was shielded by miles of occupied territory, protected by supply routes stretching across southern Ukraine, and reinforced by one of the most heavily militarized logistical networks in the entire war. But something is changing on the battlefield. Slowly, methodically, Ukrainian forces are pushing south. Settlements are falling back under Ukrainian control. Russian defensive positions are collapsing. And the deeper Ukraine moves into the southeast, the closer it gets to the one piece of territory that holds the entire southern front together: the Crimean land bridge. At first glance, Ukraine's current advances may not look like the opening phase of a campaign to liberate Crimea. Most observers see something else entirely. They see Ukraine preparing to defend itself against a possible Russian offensive expected during the spring and summer. And that assessment is not wrong. Ukraine is preparing for Russia's next move. But at the same time, something far more significant is unfolding beneath the surface. Every kilometer that Ukrainian forces reclaim in the south is laying the groundwork for something much larger: the eventual isolation of Crimea. Because if Ukraine can sever Russia's land bridge to the peninsula, Crimea stops being a fortress and becomes a trap. To understand how this strategy is unfolding, we need to look at what Ukraine is doing right now on the battlefield. While global attention has been focused on diplomatic tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and on the ongoing American operation in Iran, Ukrainian assault units have been steadily advancing in the southeast of the country. The push is concentrated in the direction of Orikhiv and the Zaporizhzhia region. According to News Sky, Ukrainian forces have already liberated several settlements in this southeastern direction as of early March. These gains include dominant elevations that now give Ukrainian forces critical observation and strike advantages. From these heights, Ukrainian units can monitor Russian movements while directing drone strikes, electronic warfare attacks, and artillery fire. And those operations are already producing results. Russian units are being forced to withdraw in ways not seen for years. Additional details reported by the New Voice of Ukraine expand on the scale of these operations. According to statements from the Ukrainian General Staff published on Telegram, the systematic destruction of Russian forces and logistical infrastructure in the southeast has led to significant battlefield gains. 9 settlements have already been liberated. 3 additional settlements have been cleared of Russian forces. And Ukrainian troops are currently working to liberate several more. Positions that were once considered heavily fortified Russian defensive zones have now been retaken. The cost to Russia has been severe. Since the start of the operation on January 29, Russian forces have suffered 6,537 casualties, including 4,355 irreversible losses. Ukrainian forces have also destroyed 419 pieces of Russian military equipment, including 147 artillery systems, more than 240 vehicles, and 14 armored combat vehicles. In addition, 108 Russian drone command posts have been destroyed, and all of these losses occurred in just one operational direction. Every Ukrainian push deeper into the south is forcing Russia to commit more resources while steadily weakening its defensive capacity. The Russian response has increasingly appeared disorganized, with defensive lines struggling to hold against sustained Ukrainian pressure. On February 20, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that Ukrainian forces had already liberated approximately 300 square kilometers, or roughly 115 square miles, of territory in the southeastern part of the country. Since then, additional territory has been reclaimed. By March 2, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrskyi, reported something that had not happened since Ukraine's Kursk offensive in August 2024. For the first time in months, Ukraine was regaining territory faster than Russia was able to capture it. This reversal is not accidental. It is the result of a deliberate battlefield strategy that Ukraine has been carefully building across the southern front. And this is where the real objective begins to emerge. Because the current advances are not just about reclaiming villages or pushing Russian forces backward. They are about expanding what military planners call the gray zone. These gray zones are areas that are not firmly controlled by either side. They sit between the main defensive lines of Ukrainian and Russian forces, and they are constantly shifting as attacks and counterattacks reshape the battlefield. Ukraine has learned to weaponize these zones. Here's how the process works. First, Ukrainian artillery, drone strikes, and assault units attack Russian-held positions on the front lines. This pressure forces Russian forces to abandon positions that were previously considered secure. Those abandoned areas immediately become gray zones. Then Ukrainian units move in to clear the remaining resistance inside those zones. Once Russian presence collapses, the territory is fully liberated and absorbed back into Ukrainian control. But the strategy does not stop there, because the moment Ukraine consolidates one gray zone, it immediately begins pushing south again to create another. Expand, constrict, expand again. Each cycle pushes the front line deeper into Russian-occupied territory. And every time the gray zone moves south, the next target moves closer. One location in particular now sits directly in the path of Ukraine's advancing strategy, Tokmak. And once Tokmak enters the battlefield equation, something much bigger comes into view, Crimea. But before Ukraine can threaten the peninsula itself, it must first tighten the logistical noose around Russia's southern army. And that process is already underway. What makes the gray zone strategy so dangerous for Russia is not just the shifting front lines. It is what Ukraine fills those zones with once they appear, drones. Once an area becomes contested territory, Ukrainian forces begin saturating it with unmanned systems. Reconnaissance drones patrol overhead. FPV drones hunt vehicles and infantry. Artillery is directed by live aerial surveillance. The result is that large sections of the battlefield transform into lethal corridors where Russian forces struggle to move men, equipment, or supplies without being detected. These gray zones often stretch 10 kilometers or more behind the recognized combat lines, turning what used to be relatively safe rear areas into killing grounds for Russian logistics. Every truck convoy becomes visible. Every troop movement becomes vulnerable. Every resupply mission becomes a gamble. Russian drones are present in these zones as well, but Ukraine has been consistently creating a logistical nightmare for Russia by disrupting supply lines and isolating forward units. As Russian forces struggle to move equipment through these contested spaces, their ability to sustain defensive positions weakens. Ukraine, meanwhile, continues pushing forward. Positions are fortified as Ukrainian troops advance. Assault units clear out resistance. Artillery follows behind the movement, maintaining pressure on Russian positions that attempt to regroup. The numbers behind this drone warfare are staggering. According to reporting from The Telegraph, around 70% of casualties in the war are now caused by drones. But drones alone do not explain Ukraine's ability to keep advancing while Russia struggles to respond. There is another key element behind these operations: network-centric warfare. New Sky describes Ukraine's tactical approach in simple terms. Ukrainian units are operating as parts of a single, integrated system where battlefield data is constantly shared across the entire force. The backbone of that system is real-time drone reconnaissance. As Ukrainian reconnaissance drones patrol the gray zones, they transmit live video feeds showing Russian troop movements, vehicle columns, defensive positions, and withdrawal routes. That information does not stay isolated with a single unit. Instead, it is fed into a centralized Ukrainian battlefield network known as Delta. The Delta system has become one of the most important technological tools in Ukraine's military. Created in 2021, just 1 year before Russia launched its full-scale invasion, Delta is a cloud-based situational awareness platform that collects and distributes battlefield intelligence across Ukrainian forces. Drone footage flows into the system. Satellite imagery is integrated alongside it. Human intelligence reports are uploaded in real time. All of this information becomes instantly accessible to Ukrainian units across the battlefield. A commander can open a laptop, tablet, or even a smartphone and immediately see what reconnaissance drones are observing on the front lines. Russian troop movements appear. Vehicle concentrations are marked. Drone strike results are confirmed. If an FPV drone successfully destroys a vehicle or artillery position, the proof appears inside Delta. If a Russian unit retreats from a defensive line, that information spreads instantly through the network. The entire Ukrainian force operates with a shared battlefield picture. Russia does not, and that difference has become increasingly decisive. Recent disruptions to Russian access to Starlink-based communication systems have made coordination between Russian units far more difficult. Without reliable data flow between reconnaissance units and frontline troops, Russian forces are often operating partially blind. Ukraine, by contrast, can see what is happening almost everywhere. This technological advantage is allowing Ukrainian forces to push deeper into the south with far greater precision than traditional battlefield operations would allow. Every push forward is guided by live reconnaissance. Every artillery strike is adjusted based on drone observation. Every Russian movement is tracked. Put simply, Ukraine can see the battlefield. Russia cannot. This is what is enabling Ukraine's slow but steady advance toward the south. And that advance has a destination, Tokmak, because Tokmak is not just another town on the map. It is one of the most important logistical hubs in southern Ukraine for Russian forces. And beyond Tokmak lies another key location, Melitopol. Together, these two settlements form a crucial link in Russia's southern supply network. And when those locations are threatened, the implications reach all the way to Crimea. The moment Ukraine gets close enough to these logistics hubs, something extraordinary becomes possible. Fire control. The ability to strike and disrupt the entire Crimean land bridge. And if that happens, Russia's southern army could find itself cut off from its most important supply lifeline. To understand why Tokmak and Melitopol matter so much, you have to look at the geography of Russia's war effort in southern Ukraine. Nearly everything that sustains Russia's southern army flows through a single corridor. Roads, railways, fuel convoys, ammunition trains, reinforcements. They all move through the same chain of logistics hubs stretching from Crimea into occupied southern Ukraine. At the center of that chain sit two locations, Tokmak and Melitopol. Military analysts have been pointing to this corridor for years. Back in August 2023, military writer David Axe explained the relationship between these locations in a piece for Forbes. Tokmak controls the roads leading south toward Melitopol. Melitopol, located roughly 40 miles further south, controls access to the Black Sea and the main overland supply routes that connect Russian forces in southern Ukraine with Crimea. And Crimea, in turn, has served as one of the most important logistical bases for Russia since the beginning of the war. For Russia, this supply chain forms what is often called the Crimean land bridge. Since the earliest days of the invasion in 2022, this land corridor has allowed Russia to move troops, equipment, ammunition, and fuel from Crimea directly into the southern regions of Ukraine. For years, Russian planners believed this bridge was effectively untouchable. After all, it was protected by hundreds of kilometers of occupied territory. Ukrainian forces were simply too far away to threaten the corridor with artillery or missile fire. But the battlefield map is slowly changing. As Ukrainian forces continue pushing south, every kilometer reclaimed from Russian control brings Ukraine closer to the logistics network that keeps the entire southern Russian army functioning. If Ukraine advances far enough to threaten Tokmak and Melitopol, it could achieve something that would fundamentally reshape the war. Fire control over the Crimean land bridge. Fire control does not necessarily mean physically occupying the land bridge itself. Instead, It means gaining the ability to strike supply routes, rail lines, and logistical hubs with artillery, drones, and missiles. In other words, even if Russian forces still technically hold the corridor, it would become extremely dangerous for them to use it. Convoys moving through the region would become targets. Supply trains could be destroyed. Fuel shipments could be disrupted. And the flow of reinforcements from Crimea into southern Ukraine would slow dramatically. To understand how important Crimea has been to Russia's war effort, we need to step back and look at the peninsula's role in the conflict. For nearly a decade, Russia has been transforming Crimea into a heavily militarized stronghold. After annexing the peninsula in 2014, the Kremlin invested enormous resources into building up its military infrastructure there. Air bases were expanded, missile systems were deployed, naval facilities were upgraded. By the time Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, Crimea had become both a military fortress and a logistical launchpad. Russian forces used the peninsula as a staging area to push north into southern Ukraine, rapidly capturing large swaths of territory during the early phase of the invasion. Cities like Melitopol and Tokmak fell during that initial surge. Since then, Crimea has continued to play a central role in Russia's military operations. Its ports provide access to the Black Sea, allowing Russian naval forces to support operations along Ukraine's southern coastline. But even that advantage has been slowly eroding. Ukraine has spent the past 2 years systematically targeting Russia's Black Sea fleet using long-range missiles and naval drones. The fleet has suffered heavy losses and has been forced to relocate many of its ships farther away from the waters near Ukraine. Today, the Black Sea Fleet operates with roughly 2/3 of its original strength, and its ability to influence the battlefield has been significantly reduced. That leaves the land bridge as Russia's most reliable supply route for its southern army. And that bridge is exactly what Ukraine's southern push now threatens. If Ukraine can push close enough to establish fire control over the corridor linking Crimea to southern Ukraine, the consequences for Russia would be enormous. Russian forces stationed across the southern front would face increasing difficulty receiving supplies. Fuel shortages could begin to appear. Artillery ammunition could become harder to transport. Reinforcements could take longer to arrive. Over time, these pressures would begin weakening Russia's defensive positions across the entire region. But the implications do not stop there, because once Ukraine pushes close enough to the land bridge, another possibility emerges: the ability to strike deeper into Crimea itself, and that would change the strategic balance of the entire war. If Ukraine reaches the point where it can threaten the Crimean land bridge, the consequences will not be limited to supply convoys and logistics hubs. The entire strategic role of Crimea would begin to change. For most of the war, Russia has used the peninsula not only as a logistical base, but also as a launch platform for missile strikes against Ukrainian territory. From air bases and launch sites across Crimea, Russian forces have repeatedly fired missiles toward Ukrainian cities and military positions. Ukraine has tried to counter this threat with periodic long-range drone and missile strikes targeting installations on the peninsula, but those attacks have been limited by distance. If Ukrainian forces move deeper into southern Ukraine and reclaim more territory, that distance shrinks. And the closer Ukrainian forces get, the easier it becomes to strike Russian military infrastructure across Crimea with far greater intensity. Euromaidan Press explained this dynamic in a February analysis. Russia has repeatedly used Crimea as a missile launch platform against Ukrainian territory. However, if Ukraine establishes fire control over the land bridge, it will also control territory that allows more frequent and more effective drone and missile attacks against Russian positions across the peninsula. The objective is not necessarily an immediate ground invasion. In fact, a direct assault across the narrow choke point connecting Crimea to mainland Ukraine would be extremely dangerous. Russian missiles and artillery could concentrate on that corridor if Ukrainian ground forces attempted to cross it. Instead, Ukraine's strategy appears aimed at something different, degrading Russia's ability to operate from Crimea. The more Ukraine weakens Russia's southern army and disrupts its supply lines, the more difficult it becomes for Moscow to sustain military operations across the region. And as that pressure builds, Russia's defenses in southern Ukraine begin to weaken. Military observers cited by News Sky suggest that successful Ukrainian operations in the south could create the conditions for broader campaigns aimed at liberating other occupied cities, including Berdyansk and Mariupol. Russia is clearly aware of the growing threat. Defensive positions in these areas have been heavily reinforced as Ukrainian forces continue advancing south. Fortifications are being strengthened, and Russian units are attempting to prepare for the possibility that Ukraine may eventually gain fire control over the land bridge. But Ukraine is already working to undermine those preparations. News Sky reports that Ukrainian forces have conducted multiple ATACMS strikes against ammunition depots in southern Ukraine. These attacks disrupt Russian attempts to fortify their positions and make it harder for Moscow to stockpile supplies ahead of future battles. And every kilometer Ukraine recaptures provides another launch point for drone and missile strikes targeting Crimea itself. The deeper Ukraine pushes into the south, the more pressure Russia faces across the entire region. This campaign is also revealing a larger transformation taking place on the battlefield. Ukraine's military strategy increasingly relies on technology rather than sheer manpower. Aerial drones, naval drones, and ground-based robotic systems are being used to weaken Russian defenses before Ukrainian assault units move forward. This approach has become essential for Ukraine because of the manpower challenges it faces. Defense News reports that some Ukrainian brigades are currently operating at 60%, 50%, or even as low as 30% manpower capacity. In certain sectors, as few as 12 Ukrainian soldiers are holding positions that stretch across 5 to 10 kilometers. Meanwhile, roughly 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers are reported to be absent without leave, and another 2 million people are avoiding military service. Under those conditions, Ukraine has had to compensate by leaning heavily on technology. Drone warfare now plays a central role in Ukrainian battlefield operations. Air, naval, and ground drones are used to wear down Russian positions before Ukrainian troops move in to capture territory. In many ways, Ukraine is deploying what amounts to a robotic force multiplier, and the results are visible on the battlefield. Ukrainian forces are systematically destroying Russian electronic warfare systems, including Field 21 and Zhitl platforms operating in the gray zones. These systems are designed to disrupt drone signals, so their destruction allows Ukrainian reconnaissance drones and FPV strike drones to operate more effectively. The pattern that is emerging is clear. Technology is gradually eroding the effectiveness of Russia's older Soviet-style battlefield tactics. At the same time, Russia is facing mounting manpower pressures of its own. According to Reuters reporting on March 2, Russia has ambitions to advance across multiple areas of Ukraine, including the Dnipro region and the Odessa region near the Black Sea. Russian forces are also continuing operations in the direction of the Zaporizhzhia region and toward the city of Dnipro. But Ukrainian leadership says the situation on the ground does not support those ambitions. President Zelensky stated that nothing Ukraine is currently observing suggests Russia has the capacity to achieve the kind of large-scale advances it is planning. If anything, the opposite trend is emerging. Russia is losing soldiers faster than it can replace them. The Institute for the Study of War warned toward the end of 2025 that Russia would struggle to build the strategic reserves needed for major offensives. By 2026, that prediction appears increasingly accurate. Russian forces are now suffering around 40,000 losses per month on average since November. Those losses are forcing the Kremlin to rely less on volunteer soldiers and increasingly on reserve forces. And every additional month of heavy casualties weakens Russia's ability to launch major new offensives. This is why Ukraine's southern campaign matters so much. Every piece of territory Ukraine retakes becomes territory Russia must fight to recover if it wants to advance further into Ukraine later in the year. If Ukraine eventually gains fire control over the Crimean land bridge, Russia's southern army could begin to slowly weaken as supply lines become harder to maintain. Moscow could attempt to redirect forces from other regions like Donetsk to defend the south. But doing so would weaken Russian positions on another front, and that, in turn, would create new opportunities for Ukrainian counterattacks in the east. For now, Ukraine's advances in the Zaporizhia direction have given it the initiative on the southern front. Many more battles lie ahead. But the strategy now unfolding suggests something significant is underway. Through steady territorial gains, network-centric warfare, and relentless drone operations, Ukraine is gradually reshaping the battlefield. And with every kilometer gained in the south, the possibility grows stronger that Crimea and the occupied territory surrounding it may be closer to liberation than at any point since the invasion began. Subscribe for more military insights, tech breakdowns, and updates.